Jews for to be here at the church. So I'd like you to take a look at this yellow sheet. Let me just say a word about how this yellow sheet got constructed. It's about 6 or 8 years old. And while this doesn't address initially any of the questions that were on the sheet, I'll try to make it connect to at least the first one, which is going to take some time even to answer that very first question this evening that I was asked. But before I do, I'd like, since it's impossible to separate Jews from Judaism, and the experience of Jews from the experience of the Jewish people, I wanted to ask you to take a moment to look at this list. So this is from the Jerusalem Quarterly, which I guess I might describe as the Jewish equivalent of Time Magazine, or does Time Magazine still exist? Maybe it was the equivalent, and the world is changing so quickly. And for the turn of the millennium, so this is 10 years old, or 11, they asked their readers, who are quite literate, informed, proud, to send in their list of who they voted as the 100 greatest Jews of the millennium. Okay. So here's my assignment for 2 minutes. Who do you find to be the most surprising name on this list, excluding Adam Sandler? Which I don't have a clue how he got. He's Jewish, but I don't know how he got on this list. And that's it. Actually, that's correct. I should have thought of it, and maybe next week. How many of you know his Hanukkah song? Actually, it's not unimportant as a statement about Jewish identity. That's true. Maybe that's what warrants his piece here. Okay, so put Adam Sandler back on the list, and I won't exclude anyone. Who do you find most surprising on this list? I'm going to suggest, by the way, that as you do, there's someone here who's Lutheran. That's true. That's true. So I'll start that way. Maybe that's a. So here's the assignment. Along with finding the most surprising list of, really, I didn't know she was Jewish. Okay, is who is on this list who actually died, as best we know, or certainly was confirmed in the Lutheran Church. There is a name on this list. Don't shout it out. You got to raise your hand. Okay. So take a minute. Take a minute while I put my glasses on. And then we'll come to the first question. By the way, the questions were great, and I only actually, as I hope to do tonight, because I'm guessing this will take our time, is to answer the first question, which leads us off in a lot, I hope you'll find a lot of interesting directions. Okay. So, first, who's the Lutheran on the list?
Marilyn Monroe.
So, we wish. Who said that? So Marilyn Monroe converted to Judaism to marry
Arthur Miller.
Arthur Miller, who's on the list as well. Okay, Arthur Miller is 95. Marilyn Monroe is. Yeah, of course, right. Okay, so she converted to Mary, and I always get confused and all this stuff. Was this after she was married to Joe? Yeah. Right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I guess that must be. Okay. So, but who's the Lutheran? Oh, this is a tough one for you. I knew it would be. Yeah, you may not be. Some people actually look at the list and say, "Really? I didn't." I mean, that's kind of strange for him to be on the list.
George Gershwin?
No.
Is the Lutheran still alive?
Karl Marx.
Oh, I heard it.
Karl Marx?
Karl Marx.
Oh.
Very
We
good.
don't want him.
Karl Marx. raised, his grandfather, Karl Marx's grandfather, was a rabbi. He converted to the Lutheran faith. Of course, he didn't have anything good to say about religion. Ultimately, he didn't have anything good to say about religion, and he certainly didn't have anything good to say about his Jewish heritage. I mean, I think it was, but yes, but he was baptized in the Lutheran faith. And neither you nor us may want to claim him. But, you know, I think, well, we can talk about it. What does that mean? Because that's actually an interesting thing. Let me just say a word about that. Maybe you'll appreciate this. I got into a conversation a couple of weeks ago with the Catholic chaplain who's on the campus, and he said in passing that he had invited into his class the person who teaches Catholic studies at Macalester. So there's this distinction between the academic piece of Macalester, where we teach religious studies kind of academically, the same way we teach biology or history or sociology, and kind of the confessing piece, the chapel and those who serve in the chaplaincy. But he had invited in, so the priest who comes to the campus had invited in Jim Lane, who's a convert to Catholicism from his Baptist roots in Texas. And in the course of the conversation, I hope that this is okay. Oh, this is certainly okay to say. He said, Jim Lane said about the Catholic Church and kind of the struggles of these last number of years, which I don't have to enumerate. He said about his Catholic Church and his faith, well, I hope this is okay to say. Remember, you got to imagine yourself on the college campus. Okay? Well, the church may be a whore, but she's still my mother. And I said, so he said that to me, and then when I saw Jim a couple of days later, after hearing this direct quote, I said to Jim, so that's exactly how I might say it, which is I may say, the Jewish people can drive me crazy, but they are still my people. And to which Jim said yes. And that's often the difference between Catholicism and Judaism and the Protestant faith. In the Protestant faith, if you don't like what happens in the Protestant faith, what do? You start another church. Exactly. That's exactly right. In other words, it's America, it's voluntary, it's congregational. You don't like what's happening in there, you go and do either another Lutheran church or kind of like that place that I just pulled off the highway, kind of down the street of New Hope or whatever. Yeah, kind of that. So that's exactly what happens. And there is this distinction, and I think I would say that that's a kind of interesting thing that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about. Okay, so now, before we get talking about the subject, who's the most interesting name on this list to you? The one that you didn't know besides Marilyn Rowe that you would have that you said, wow, that's really an interesting one. Karl Marx. Well, Karl Marx, born Jewish, and I guess on some level, yes.
How does he become what's the criteria to be the greatest Jew?
Yes, that's a really great question. Is it about influence on the world? Is it about influence on kind of Jewish history? Is it about place in kind of Jewish life over the course of, I think that's a superb question, and I don't have an answer to that, because I don't know what they're, I mean, they talk about, I think they say a little word, don't they?
It just says ranked by the readers, so it's just popular.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like there's any real criteria.
I don't think that there were, I mean, just, kind of name it. But I will say, and I'll come back to it, the top 10 names gets us directly to our subject. So just let me say a word, not talking about names that some that you've heard. Albert Einstein, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, Theodor Herzl, the visionary who came up with the idea at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, after a very famous moment in world history in France. This assimilated, irreligious Jew, which Theodor Herzl was, comes up with this idea that the Jews need to get out of Europe and find a place of safety. Of course, by the time that all happened, it was in some ways too late. But it's Theodor Herzl who is the visionary for the creation of the State of Israel, with all of its, and I'd be happy if at some point this comes up in the conversation, and I hope it does, the complications, the ethical complications, the political complications of the State of Israel today is certainly something that I'm willing to engage in almost any question, but I think that's an appropriate one, especially in an interfaith setting to talk about. So Theodor Herzl, Sigmund Freud, okay? Sigmund Freud, the great founder of psychoanalysis. So we'll go through this. Moses Maimonides, which I'll come to him in just a second again. Rashi, Yitzhak Rabin, Golda Meir, Jonas Salk, all of us who have been taken care of that way, and the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. So if I were to list Jews on that first top 10 who are religious, by which I mean stepped into a synagogue, and I don't know if I define that as being religious, but the only ones who I would say were regular synagogue worshipers on this list: Moses Maimonides, Rashi, and the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, the pietistic. That's all. Sigmund Freud spoke of religion as the kind of grand illusion. Okay? And yet, when asked in a very famous moment in his life, in 1935, Sigmund Freud in Vienna, not a very good place and not a very safe place to be a Jew. Of course, by 1938, it was going to be a disastrous place to be a Jew. But in 1935, he was invited to speak at a kind of a fraternal Jewish organization, no longer really exists, called B'nai B'rith. Maybe you've heard of this fraternal organization. And he's asked to speak about his Jewish identity. It's the only time in his whole life that Sigmund Freud uses the term identity. And he speaks about why he claims, despite the fact that he is not religious, why he claims a Jewish identity, and he speaks of the things that he gained from his Jewish identity. In brief, in quite amazing and articulate language, he says, 2 things I gained from my Jewish identity: a commitment to the life of the mind, to serious intellectual pursuit, and a willingness to go it against the easy majority. A willingness to go it alone. And I think that's a very telling kind of look at what it must have meant for Sigmund Freud and what it might mean for even Jews today. So I'll come back to this list, but I want to ask you to turn with me to the first question that I was asked when I walked in. I think I would say that and by the way, on the back side, if we have time maybe next week, we'll talk a little bit about these definitions of Judaism and why those might be helpful for our conversation. But here's the first question that I was asked, and that first question, I took it straight from the pastor's email to me, is when will they know that the Messiah has arrived? Very good question. And I said to myself, someone's been studying the Talmud to kind of, because that's essentially the question. That's the answer. There's an answer, as it were, in the Talmud that seems to respond to that question. This might be the first time that you've had the opportunity to study the Talmud. It's a little bit interesting to study a piece from the rabbinic literature. I'll talk a little bit about rabbinic literature in just a second. But just to plunge you into it without saying a word about it, I want to ask you to turn with me to a text from the 3rd century. So this is a couple hundred years after the death of Jesus. Best as we can guess, Jesus is crucified in the year 30. That's probably right, which means he was probably 32 or 33, because the calendar got all messed up with the zero, and I'm sure you've all studied that. So the rabbinic period, and one of the earliest texts in the rabbinic period, I'll have a word to say about it in a minute, is this text called the Pirkei Avot. So the Hebrew word avot is from a Hebrew word that will sound familiar to you if I say it in its singular form, and that is the word Abba, which means father. That's what my children call me, they still call me. And the plural of Av, Abba is the term of endearment. Av is the Hebrew word for father. Abba is like daddy. Okay? So Abba is daddy, Av is father, and Avot is the plural of it. And in the 4th chapter of the Ethics, or the Chapters of the Fathers, which is kind of in what is called the Mishnah, which is the earliest compilation of rabbinic texts, we read the following. Rabbi Jacob used to say, better is 1 hour of teshuvah, turning around, getting your life in order, going in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction, which is the Hebrew word for repentance. But repentance is understood in the Jewish tradition as literally turning in the right direction, getting your stuff together, and getting it in alignment with the teachings of the faith, getting it in alignment with God, getting it in alignment with the spiritual and ethical values that define who you are and who defines your tradition. So, better is 1 hour of teshuvah and good deeds in this world than the whole life of the world to come. Yikes. But he wasn't finished. And better is 1 hour of spiritual bliss in the world to come than all the life of this world. So you would look at this and you would say, that's a paradox. Yes, yes. Which is not an unusual stance to take with regard to this. So what is better? Getting your life, and I'm not asking you to give an answer. You might have your own personal answer. Better 1 moment of bliss in the world to come than all of this life? 1 second, what does it say there? 1 hour. Better 1 hour of spiritual bliss in the world to come than all of this life? And better is this life and doing the right thing and doing good deeds than getting the keys to the world to come. So it's a paradox because I think it reflects, my guess, Rabbi Jacob's own struggles with, so finally, what is better? What makes life worthwhile? How do I measure the good life lived? Yes?
Does that implies a life after?
That implies a life after, and I would say, absolutely, and I would say that there is no way to understand the broad reach of the rabbinic tradition, which, for kind of in short order, and Pastor Strummer and I talked a little bit about this. I mean, kind of in how the rabbinic tradition comes to be and what it's reacting against. The rabbinic tradition, for kind of just in terms of putting it, is essentially the tradition that begins with the collapse of the Second Jewish Commonwealth and the dispersion of the people in the year 70. So 40 years after the death of Jesus, the temple is destroyed and the people are vanquished, taken off by the Romans. Then they rebel again. They were a stiff-necked, miserable group who never could take no for an answer. Okay, and they get themselves clobbered again in the year 135, the Hadrianic persecutions, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and quite remarkable and terrible moment in the history of the Jewish people. And then they are really exiled. Then they're taken off in chains, and as best we know, that's the end of a kind of extant Jewish community. Some remain, but for quite a long time, until probably, while a community remains, some that are not, kind of Jewish destiny and sovereignty ends at the year 70, and then forever until 1948 in the year 135 with the Hadrianic persecutions. And the rabbinic period begins at this time and extends, 7, 8 centuries with the whole literature. And what I would say is it's impossible to understand the development of rabbinic literature without understanding their belief and commitment, sometimes not well defined, but certainly present, about another world, their word for it, an olam haba, a coming world, or malchut shamayim, the kingship of heaven, or the kingship of God. So yes, absolutely, that implies and suggests that Rabbi Jacob is struggling with his teachers or his own beliefs, or exactly how he does it, but he's struggling with something. So now, to plunge into the text. The first rabbinic text is this text from the 3rd century. It's actually, we think it's probably edited in the year 212, 214 is their kind of guess. So this is, right well before kind of the formulations of these faiths, and I'll say a little bit about that in just a second. And the Talmud, which is the commentary on the Mishnah, as the Mishnah is the commentary on the Bible. Okay? So you have the Bible canonized, namely the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, sorry, not the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Scriptures, Tanakh, canonized, put together in the order or way in which we think it's canonized. And canon in this sense means put in the cabinet. These are the books that go in the cabinet, and those that don't get in the cabinet are outside the canon. And there are a lot of books that don't get in the cabinet. Okay? We call them by names like
Jubilees.
the Apocrypha. Yes, like books like the Jubilees and Tobit and Ben Sirah and a lot of others, preserved, ironically or not ironically, preserved gratefully by the church, which preserves these books, which are books written around the same time, and they appear in, for example, do they appear in, for example, when you have like the New Revised Standard Version? Does it include the Apocrypha?
So not typically, but
Not typically.
some do. You can obtain it.
Yeah, but if I were to ask that question in a Catholic parish, they would say yes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So the Talmud, I don't know what it means to be published. It's a different term. But the Talmud, as the commentary on the Mishnah, as the Mishnah is the commentary on the Bible, is around the year somewhere between the 6th and 7th century. And we read this story. I remember the first time I studied this story with a Lutheran group was at Luther Seminary, where I used to teach. The president of the seminary was there with us, Dr. David T. Some of you might know Dr. T. And he was really intrigued with this story, and it's a pretty interesting one. And this is the direct answer to the question, when will they know that the Messiah has arrived? So here's the text taken from the Talmud, from a tractate known as Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yochanan said, when you see a generation ever dwindling, hope for the Messiah. Rabbi Yochanan said, when you see a generation overwhelmed by many troubles as by a river, await him. Rabbi Yochanan also said, the Son of David will come only in a generation that is either altogether righteous or altogether wicked. Okay. Next sentence. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi met Elijah. So who's Elijah? In the grand narrative of the Messiah, who is Elijah? Prophet, who will, in the Jewish tradition, according to the Bible, this phenomenal story, right? Elijah he goes off on a chariot, doesn't, right? So, quite amazing story. And so he is the announcer of the Messiah. He will return to announce. And by the way, I just have to say, Elijah has this quite stunning role to play in Judaism over the course of the 2,000 years as this develops, to some extent within Christianity and within Islam. Each of the three monotheistic Western faiths take Elijah, this very electrifying, mysterious figure, and will invest him with great significance. So Elijah is, according to tradition, present at every baby naming and circumcision for a Jewish baby boy. Yes, shows up. Elijah is present at the end of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He is present at every single Passover Seder celebration. A cup is set for Elijah at every table. And finally, according to the Talmud, all of the unanswered questions, all of the riddles of our life, the uncertainties, the heartbreaks, it will be Elijah who will provide the answers for at the end of time. In the Talmud, every time they are stumped by a question that they can't figure out the answer to, they say, Tishbi, his name, Elijah the Tishbite, okay? Tishbi yitaretz kushiot ubayot. Tishbi, Elijah will explain all of the riddles, all of the paradoxes, and all of the uncertainties of life. So he has this kind of magic role, but he's in the Messianic tradition, as the Messianic tradition develops within Judaism, he is the announcer of the arrival of the Messiah. So that's why his role is here. So we read, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi met Elijah standing by the entrance of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's tomb. He asked him, when will the Messiah come? That's your question, folks. Go and ask him yourself. Where is he? He's at the entrance to the gates of Rome. Gates of Rome? That's where the enemy was. Okay. This was Rome. Rome, which had destroyed the civilization, which had vanquished the people, and the Messiah is hanging out at the gates of Rome. Okay. How will I recognize him? Well, he's sitting among the poor lepers. Kind of terrible disease. All of them, and now it's a little murky, all of them untied them all at once and rebandaged them together, whereas he unties and rebandages each separately before treating the next, thinking, should I be wanted, it being time for my appearance as the Messiah, I must not be delayed through having to bandage a number of sores. So here's the question before we continue this. So according to this story, Elijah, the Messiah is alive. at the gates of Rome, presumably right now. And what's he doing? He's waiting and helping
the least of these.
helping the least of these. Or, so here's the question about this text. It's not clear from the text whether he's taking off his bandages as well and putting them on, and then taking off of the others, the least of these, and rebanding one after another, and whether he unties, I mean, does he, if it's okay, if he unties all of them, heals them, puts on the salve and then goes and does it, or he does one at a time, not wanting, if all of a sudden someone says, hey, it's time for you to go do your thing, okay? It's not clear that he doesn't want to leave anybody in the lurch. So, as a text, before we go to the end of it, what does this say at this moment about at least how this text understands the character of the Messiah?
To me, it makes sense. It makes sense because I can see how that would relate to the fact that he's going to come at the right time, and we'll recognize him because of what's happened. He's already here.
Or he's already here. Oh, so he's already here,
But not revealed.
but not revealed.
The way we typically
Pardon?
think of it is a healer.
He's a healer. Or, yes, he's a healer. But it's also possible to understand this text that way, that he's actually it's also possible to understand the text that he's doing it also to himself. That he's unwrapping the bandages, not only of the people he's taking care of as healers, but also of himself, which would say about him that, or, I don't know why him, right, okay, what?
That he's not easily recognized.
He's not easily recognized, and
He has an identity with us.
he has an identity with us.
He doesn't know when he'll be revealed.
He doesn't know when it'll be revealed.
He might be in disguise.
He could be
Might
sick.
be in disguise, or
I said he could be sick.
he could be sick. He could be wounded. He could be wounded. Or as we might say, he might be a wounded healer.
And he doesn't know when he will be summoned.
And he doesn't
He has
know.
to be prepared.
Yes. So next week we'll talk a little bit more about interfaith stuff, but let me just at this point give you the most illustrious story about interfaith, and that is, a number of different writers. The one I'm most familiar with who says this is the famous Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who's a great proponent of interfaith conversation, would have been very happy to know that I'm not that he knew me, but that I was here at a church, that a rabbi was coming in to speak at a church. He would have thought that one of the most important things in contemporary American society to happen, and world society. And by the way, I will say parenthetically, the famous Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's been studied who kind of talks about the importance of time and the Sabbath, is the book he's most well known for. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who survived and got out of Germany in 1935, makes the audacious claim, which I think is quite compelling. I don't know if I could ever prove it, but makes the claim that had there been in 1935 interfaith dialogue in Germany, the Holocaust never would have unfolded. Had people been able to talk to one another and learn from one another and understand religions as being able to be informed by their conversation with each other, those events could never. I don't know whether I buy that or not, to tell you the truth, and I don't know how we would ever measure it, but perhaps. So Rabbi Yitz Greenberg would have been very pleased by this conversation unfolding here at Mount this evening. And here's what he says at the end of a very famous article about the importance of interfaith dialogue. So the word goes out that the Messiah has arrived. And ABC, NBC, and CBS, and I guess now, I mean, if he would have written it now, he would have said Microsoft and Apple and whoever, and see, all right. Everybody goes running out to find out and get the scoop on the Messiah. And they stick the microphone right up close to him, and they say, all right, so we have one question which we need to ask you. Is this your first or second arrival? And he says, what's the difference? Which I think is a pretty compelling answer. Okay? When it finally happens, I mean, what would the difference be if the world is finally, as we would say in the Jewish tradition, redeemed? Okay. So, now to go back to the story. So, a wounded healer, or a healer of others. So he went to him and greeted him, saying to the Messiah, "Peace upon you, master and teacher. Peace upon you, O son of Levi." He replied, "When will you come, master?" Messiah answers, "Today." On his returning to Elijah, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi inquired, "So what did he say to you?" "Well, he spoke falsely to me. For he said that he would come today, but he has not." Elijah answered, "You misunderstood." He was quoting scripture where it says in Psalms 95:7. I have not that I've studied New Testament as much as I've studied, but I think there's also a similar citation maybe in Hebrews. No. I have something close to, right? Something like in maybe Hebrews, he's going to check me out. Like in chapter 3 or so, maybe? I don't know, I think I saw a reference, something like that maybe. Today, if only you will listen to God's voice. So this is a very mysterious text. I don't actually know what to make of it.
You just, when you quoted that, you said today if only listen to God's voice instead of his voice. Does that mean the Messiah is God in the Jewish tradition, or is the Messiah not necessarily God?
Not all God, no. Messiah is, no, not at all. In the Jewish tradition, the Messiah is, as it were, God's agent for announcing. I think it's that one of the really interesting pieces to trace in the long history, now I want to say a word about this, of how in the tradition, I think, the way, for example, contemporary Christian and Jewish scholars of this period, the first 3 or 4 centuries, would speak of the process by which Jesus became Christ and Christ became God. And I think that, that language is what scholars, I'm not talking about the faithful, I'm talking about the history of scholarship, how that transformation developed over the course of, the scholars would say, a couple centuries, as ideas are beginning to flow in and go through some debate is, I think, a quite intriguing thing. But I think he might have, is there something you'd like?
I do, bingo.
Bingo!
Hebrews 3, verse 7, "Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion."
There you go. Yeah. So that's Hebrews 3:7.
3:7.
3:7. Okay. So what are we to do with this text? Or what did I want to do with the text? So what I wanted to do with the text is to say, you can go and read this rabbinic text. Quite mysterious. But I took the question also to say, so what do modern Jewish forms of faith do with this idea about the Messiah? So the rabbinic tradition develops over the course of a number of centuries, but modern Judaism today is all descended from rabbinic Judaism. But what we speak of today, when we speak of American Judaism, of the synagogues, that people, kind of the broad reach of America today, we speak of, and maybe you've heard these terms, Orthodox synagogues, Reform temples, conservative synagogues, maybe other terminology. But those are the big three divisions in American Judaism. And by the way, this is at least I should mention this. How many Jews are there in America? Well, how many Americans are there? 330 million. 330 million. How many Jews are there in America?
6 million?
About somewhere between 5 and 6. 5 and 6 million. And there's about 5.5 million in Israel today. And there's maybe another 3 million scattered across the world. So we're talking about 15 million Jews in the world today. Tiny. I mean, in America, Jews represent essentially 2% of the population. I think many people find that quite shocking. Yeah. Okay. By the way, I mean, here's a more amazing statistic. How many Jews were in Germany in 1939? Probably about 500,000. Probably about 500,000 out of a total German population of somewhere between 60 and 65 million. So they were a tiny number in Germany. So, which I think is quite surprising. The vast majority of ultimately what are known as the victims of the Holocaust are not German Jews, but are Jews of the contiguous countries, Poland, Hungary, and those. Yes?
You just relayed to me a very interesting fact. I went to a high school in Milwaukee that the population was about 35% Jewish, 30% Catholic, and the rest Protestant. So I was exposed as a high school student and had many Jewish friends. And I've been in synagogues, and to know that they're that scarce, that I was in that concentration, was really news to me.
So, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, the history is fascinating of how this community, this relatively small community, has kind of stuck together, kind of stuck it out, maybe both. Stuck together and stuck it out might be not a bad way of saying it. I think I went to a high school in St. Louis, Missouri, which was called University City, but underneath our breath, I think the Jews and the non-Jews spoke of it not as U City, but as Jew City. Okay. I mean, because there were about a third of the high school was, Jewish kids. I mean, the community kind of gravitated together. I mean, the institutions were together. In those years, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people were traditional. They walked to synagogue often, so they needed to be contiguous to where their synagogue was because they weren't driving on the Sabbath. I mean, I think there are a lot of kind of socioeconomic reasons why they kind of stayed together. There's another one which you might find of interest. It's a long and interesting piece of history of the Minneapolis Jewish community and the Minneapolis community. And by the way, I should have guessed, at least to give you the statistic, how many Jews are there in the Twin Cities? Probably, the Twin Cities, probably about 45,000. Okay? About 30,000 Minneapolis and about 10,000 on the St. Paul side. So Minneapolis is growing, the St. Paul Jewish community is holding its own or shrinking a little. But at one point, How many of you are old-time Minneapolis go back a long way in Minneapolis? So some of you might know this. At one point, the Jewish community of Minneapolis couldn't live any place but North Minneapolis. And North Minneapolis means north of 394, north of 394, west of 94 as it goes north out of downtown, up to what is now, I guess we would say, Golden Valley. And they couldn't live that way because Minneapolis, I know this will sound like a shock, and it is shocking. Minneapolis was the most anti-Semitic city in all of North America. You couldn't buy a house in South Minneapolis because the covenants of the houses forbade the buyer of the house. When you bought the house, it had in it a covenant, an agreement which says, I will not sell my house to a Jew or a colored person. Okay? And those were eventually, you couldn't, I know this, now you'll think I'm making this up. Okay, but you can check me out. You go back and read the Star and the Tribune when they were divided newspapers from the 1930s, and they had all the ads say Jews and colored need not apply. Okay, I mean it's all over the place. And the most, in some ways, humorous piece of all of this, and humorous now, we can laugh about it. I know they weren't laughing about it in the 1930s, I guess. I'm sure they were. Was that Jews couldn't belong to the AAA. Couldn't get your car towed in Minneapolis. Okay? Who broke that? The mayor of Minneapolis in 1948. And for $48,000, his name was Hubert Humphrey. Very good. Right, and that's the reason that Hubert Humphrey, mayor of Minneapolis, became a great hero to the Jewish community, because he said, what is going on here? And so that was 1948, which of course to us sounds like ancient history, 1948, but for members of the Jewish community. So yes, I think that sense of kind of being together. So there are the denominations of American Judaism as they develop, all modern in the sense that, as best we know,
Elijah's here.
Elijah's here.
So this is just a little tease about next week. We won't get to this. I mean, as I talk about the importance, as your pastor talks about the importance of people of different faiths getting to know one another, a book like this, Jesus Through Jewish Eyes, would have been unimaginable 30 years ago or 20 years ago. That Jews are thinking about Jesus, esteeming Jesus, exploring Jesus, quoting Jesus, would have been unfathomable. And that's part of the greatness of what Hubert Humphrey did in 1948, and what great leaders of religion here by the way, I would say here in the Twin Cities. I mean, great interfaith leaders who said, we're gonna turn this around, and we're gonna have an opportunity for Christians and Jews, for Protestants, for Lutherans. The Lutheran Church led the way in getting that transformed. And one of the most illustrious Lutheran bishops of the Twin Cities, okay, in turning around, and Archbishop Roach from the Catholic Church, and Rabbi Max Shapiro, who was at the big Reform Temple on Hennepin Avenue, kind of turned that kind of piece around. So these three denominations, which all grew up in the modern era, at the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, as Jews were trying to figure out how they could remain religious and figure their way out in a new world, and what we call the three great movements in American, movements or denominations or streams. It's not exactly like denominations in Christianity, but it's close enough. Are Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. And what I thought when I saw that question, I said to myself, well, at the very least, what I'd like to do is to show you what each of them says about the question that you asked. So just one word, and then I'll take some questions. And we'll come back to this next week. I have what the Orthodox tradition says that follows, and you can read it on your own. And then the conservative one, which is the next one down, and then the one from the Reform movement. And they say very different things about what they believe about the Messiah. I think you would find it, I'm guessing, quite intriguing to kind of think about. But here's a way of trying to link all of them. All of them talk essentially of a triple hope about the future. And so this might help you over the next week just to think about the divergence of views that you see here. The classic Jewish teaching about the world to come, what's called by that fancy Greek word eschaton, eschatology, kind of thinking about the future, talks of a great triple hope. A hope about the world, a hope about the people of Israel, and a hope about our individual lives. So, the hope for the world is about a world at peace, redeemed. I guess we might say a world in which there is no more cancer, and no more AIDS, and no more airplanes dropping out of the sky, and no more tsunamis. A return to the Garden of Eden. Before we know what happened in the Garden of Eden. Right? So a return to, as it were, the world of creation as it was intended by God. So that's the hope for creation, or for the universe. And the hope that the tradition develops for the people of Israel, which is a hope that the people will be gathered together by, as the tradition understood it. I want to remove the political issue of Israel for a minute. But as the tradition understood it, the people of Israel will be gathered back to their land, to the land of Israel. The Holy Land is what Christians might call it. Okay? And for individuals, the hope on two levels, a hope in the eternity of the soul after death, and the hope in the resurrection of the body. So this triple hope, a hope about the world, a hope about the people, and a hope about the individual. A hope that all of them survive death, defeat death, as it were, okay, in the great hope. That informs how each of the various movements in American Judaism, the Orthodox, which today comprise only about 7 or 8% of American Jews, and the conservative movement, the movement in the middle, happens to be the one that the school that I went to was conservative. I grew up at a conservative synagogue in St. Louis, but now I teach, don't particularly identify or affiliate with any of them in terms of my teaching. I still attend a conservative congregation. But the conservative movement, which maybe constitutes about 25 or 30% of affiliated Jews, and the Reform movement, which is about another 25 or 30%. And if you've been keeping count, you said, but that doesn't equal 100, okay? I know, because the rest are unaffiliated, are just Jews, or they're whatever, okay? And that's probably, I think in Christianity you call those the unchurched, okay, or something else maybe.
Yep. There are other names. If you want.
Oh, there are, yes. I can imagine. So, those three movements, and each of them have a distinct and interesting kind of way of thinking about this. as each of the movements struggle to say, well, do I and how do I continue to take traditional belief, including belief in the world to come and survival after death, how do I make that make sense to me in this world? How do I understand, and what meaning do I have out of ideas like that in the world to come? So, let me take some questions. Oh, thank you. We have until?
Yeah, till 8.
Till 8 o'clock. Please.
I wonder, on one of the backside of the stories
Please.
you were telling us.
Yes.
Right, where it says today, if only you will listen to his voice, the Messiah comes. And when I read that, it says to me, then we, the people, are part of God's agents. We do God's work in this world. So in that sense, I don't know how to think of the Messiah, but in that sense, we are God's agents.
God's agents.
And we are the arrival of God, perhaps.
Yes. So maybe if you've gone to a synagogue, you've heard a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah kid or someone else use this term, tikkun olam, which is the Hebrew term. This is the way it would look in Hebrew. Hebrew goes from right to left as opposed to the other way around. Okay. So tikkun olam, repair of the world. And what it said, and this idea of human beings obligated to help repair the world is connected to the idea, which I think sounds quite audacious, it sounds almost heretical in some ways. In the Middle Ages, a philosopher, a mystic, comes up with this idea that God needs human beings to help him make the world a better place. That God can't do it. That God can't do it by God's self. Okay, I'm wanting to avoid male-female language here. Okay, that God can't do it alone, and needs human beings in the process of helping to make the world whole and complete. And I think there's no sense, there's no understanding of the text that you just cited, except to say, as soon as people hearken to the right way to lead their lives, ethically and spiritually, the Messiah will have arrived. However they understood that, that's what it seems to be that the text is saying. And I think that you could look at this text and what the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform movement, particularly the Conservative and Reform, the most liberal movement, Reform, and growingly say, and I think it seems to be headed in that direction. Please.
I was going to add that the first paradoxical statement there seems to me suggesting the same thing possibly. Whether God can or can't, he chooses to work through people. And to me it suggests a couple of things. One, that there can be heaven on earth in the sense that we are his agents, or whatever you want to refer to us as. But also maybe kind of almost a warning that if you focus so much on the next life, you're not going to be living the life God would have you be living today in this earth. So I kind of got those two suggestions out of that.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right about the text. And I would say this, that I think the Jewish tradition struggles tremendously with what is the clear orientation of the earlier age about the world to come as this kind of that needs to inform, and nevertheless keeps returning to the idea that one needs to put one's hands into the soil and get on with it. So here's maybe the most, I should have included this. This is a very famous passage in the Talmud, which says, if you hear that the Messiah has arrived, and you're out in the field planting a tree, finish planting the tree first before going and I don't know whether that's saying, first of all, don't be so sure. Because, the tree's going to grow, they're going to come to, I mean, if you want a sweet tango apple, it's going to take about 15 years. And you're going to have to be patient and water it and tend to it and make sure it's going to take some time. And so, I mean, I think that there is this realism piece. And by the way, in the long history of Christianity, there have been these moments in which kind of the broad sweep of Christianity has developed exactly the same kind of thing. Think about the social gospel movement at the end of the 19th century. Think about the era of the church. I wouldn't say just shaping, I would say dominating the political discourse about trying to make the world a better place during the civil rights era. And the way in which the church took the lead in trying to figure out how to say something about equality and justice for a minority which had gone and been demeaned for 200 years. And you say, this is the church struggling with trying to figure out how much it takes seriously this world as opposed to worrying about kind of the world to come. One last question that I'd be happy to take, knowing that, yes, please.
When rabbis and scholars study the Talmud, do they, let me take a step back. In the Christian church, there's of course the literal translation, the literal understanding of the Old Testament, of the Genesis story. How do most Jewish scholars and Jewish, just your average layperson view that?
Yes, I mean,
you always have a commentary in one hand and the Talmud in the other hand when you read it, or?
Two things, yes. First of all, you always have a commentary, but I think I would say the obligation is, I think I might fall back here on Martin Luther. Sola scriptura. You have to look at the text. You have to embrace the text in a very famous, this is a remarkably famous moment. The greatest Jewish theologian of the 20th century, bar none, certainly in his influence on Christianity, was the famous existentialist philosopher Martin Buber, the person who shapes the language of I and thou, this famous philosophy. And he comes to America, the only time he comes to America, and his host is the great Protestant theologian Paul Tillich. And Tillich welcomes him in to Union Seminary, famous seminary in New York City, and it's in the middle, I don't know what the particular crisis is, and someone says, well, Dr. Buber, how would you bring your faith to bear on kind of the current situation? And he says, I would take the text that Pastor Straumann has in his hand, and I would open it up, and I would engage the text, and from it, and I don't know whether he meant from the text and himself directly, or the text himself and the tradition that he had within him, would mediate that text and learn from that text and how to make come up with a solution to the text. But I would say this, that for a Jew, you build your answers based upon your tradition, the tradition inherited. You stand on that way you stand on the shoulders of giants and are able to see further. And I guess so yes, always a commentary, but always the text too. So it's kind of the authority of the text and of the commentary, but not giving it over to just the authority to tell you. You need to do the work yourself. And that's the really, I think, the real Lutheran thing about it, right? Which is you can't rely on the church to tell you what the text is. You can't rely on just the preacher. You have to rely on the text yourself.
Yeah. But there's a living word that encounters you through the text.
That's exactly right.
Well,
so I'm
yeah.
I'm sorry that I have to go, and you do too, because the trapdoor is going to open. But I will be back next week, and I hope you will too. Thank you.